Okay, here we go. Section 2. So talking, please. Okay, the national government and their relationship to the states, to the 50 states. Okay, according to the Constitution, there are 3 obligations that the national government has to the states, and I know this happens to be on the test. Okay, they're all easy to understand. The first one is written in old school writing, but the Constitution says that the national government must guarantee to every state a Republican form of government. This does not mean the Republican political party. They don't have to say every state has to be Republican. This comes from the word a republic. A better way of translating this would say that every state has to be represented. That the national government must make sure that every state is represented in the Union. In other words, that they're all represented in the National Congress. The second one says that the national government is required to provide the defense of the states from foreign invasion and aid protection against domestic violence in the United States. And again, this is obvious to us that if someone attacks one of our states, the national government is going to come fight and protect us. But this is put in the Constitution because when they create the Constitution, they took away the states' war-making powers. Under the Articles of Confederation, the states could have their own military and their own war-making powers. But since that's taken away, it says the national government has to defend each of the states. And the third one is that the national government must respect the territorial integrity of each of the states. In other words, they have to respect our borders, our boundaries. They cannot say, oh, California, you're so big, and Arizona is so small. We're going to take a piece of California and give it to Arizona. Nor can they say, California, you're so big, we're going to cut you into 2 different states. And now there's going to be a Northern California and a Southern California state. Yes, one of us do. Who wants to, the North or the South? The North. Because they make a lot of the money and we take a lot of the money. We have a lot more welfare. But we could if we wanted to. But the national government cannot mess with our borders. So those are 3 things you need to know each of them for the test. This next part is not on the test. You do not need to write any of this down. You guys might need to know what FEMA is for the test. FEMA, at the bottom here, is the Federal Emergency Management Agency. If there is a national disaster, they are the ones who are supposed to come help us out. Supposed to. If you were around during Hurricane Katrina, then you could argue that they didn't. Management Agency. So here's how it's supposed to go down. Let's say that there's a huge earthquake in Hawthorne, and all the buildings are destroyed and people are dying. First, the local government is supposed to respond, Hawthorne. And if they're overwhelmed, they contact the state. They contact the governor. The state responds by sending resources, including the National Guard, food and water. They do a damage assessment. If it's really bad, they ask the president to do a major disaster declaration. FEMA comes down, they're from the federal government, and they look at and they do an analysis. If it's real bad, then the president approves a request, or FEMA informs it's been denied. And then if they approve it as a national disaster, a major disaster, FEMA is supposed to come out and help provide food and shelter and water and security, things like that. Now, if it happened back maybe like, 5 years ago or so in New Orleans and Louisiana, and it was a disaster. Okay, 3 weeks later, after it occurred, there were still tens of thousands of people living in football stadiums and soccer stadiums without any toilets and without much food in filthy conditions. And there are still dead bodies floating down the streets in the water. So people were very, very upset about how FEMA handled the situation. Last year, or a year and a half ago or so, there was another disaster. What was it called? Hurricane Sandy. Okay, and it was in New Jersey. And things went a lot better. The government showed up quick. FEMA showed up quick. People giving people food and water, etc. Now, for us optimists out there, is that the right word? Optimists? It's because FEMA and the federal government, they learned from their mistakes. That they realized what they did at Hurricane Katrina down in Louisiana wasn't the right way, and they were much better. For you cynics out there, why might you think that it was much better when it was in New Jersey rather than in Louisiana? Yeah, more rich people, more white people. In Louisiana, when you watch the news, was a lot of poor black people. Or as Kanye West so eloquently put it, George Bush hates black people. That's what Kanye West said. Yeah. Okay, again, none of this, you won't see any of this on this test. You probably won't see it on the AP test. The only question that might be on the AP test is what is FEMA? Or who's supposed to help if there's a national disaster. You might be able to if you need to try to make something up for an essay question about federalism. Here you got the national government helping out the states and the states working together. But unlikely to be needed. This, however, is on this test. Admitting a new state. So let's say we want to have a 51st state. Who can decide to have a new state? Congress, only the national government. Oh, I guess I should have asked before I put it up. Only Congress can. California cannot, New York cannot. And here's how the system goes down. Let's say Puerto Rico wants to become the 51st state of the United States. The first thing that happens is Congress passes an enabling act, which tells the territory or whichever area wants to become a state, go ahead and write a state constitution. If we make you a state, what would your constitution say? And then Congress looks at it, reviews it, reads it, and decides, okay, we like your constitution, that's good. Then they pass an act of admission, and the territory now becomes the 51st state. So the first thing that happens, someone wants to become a state, they pass the Enabling Act, make a constitution. Congress looks at it, reviews it, if they like it. Then they do an Enabling Act, then they do an act of admission. Then they become a new state. Now, the Congress can put conditions on it. When Utah wanted to become a state, they got the Enabling Act. Congress goes, okay, Utah, write your state constitution. They write it. Congress looks at it, and they're like, this is good, this is good. Oh, my God, what do you have here? Polygamy. Utah had in their state constitution that they were going to allow polygamy, having more than one wife. Because the vast majority of Utah happens to be Mormon, and part of the Mormon religion allows for polygamy. And Congress goes, no, you can't do this. So Utah takes it out, and Congress goes, okay, you're in now, you're a state. Now, this can be circumvented. Here's another example of what happens. Arizona, when they want to become a state, most of the time in our country, judges are appointed, not elected. The legislative branch and the executive branch, they're elected by the people. But the judges are appointed by the governor or by the president. And we'll learn why in another chapter. Well, Arizona in their state constitution said our judges are going to be elected by the people. Congress looked at it and goes, we like your constitution, but that's not how we do it here in America. Your judges have to be appointed. So they change it and they go, okay, we're going to appoint our judges. Congress goes, now we're happy. They give them the act of admission. The next day, they amend their constitution and say, okay, our judges are now going to be elected. And there's nothing Congress can do about it. So Congress has the power to say, we don't like that, but once they become a state, they can just amend their constitution, as long as they don't violate the national constitution. So, interesting little story. Okay, this part, when I give you the AP version of this lecture, we're going to go in depth on this. It is incredibly important. On this one, for the regular government class, it only talks about cooperative federalism. And I'm going to stop for a minute and tell you about this. We have dual federalism, and we have cooperative federalism. And it's guaranteed 100% to be on the AP test. 100%. Dual federalism is where, we know federalism, we have a national government and a state government. Dual federalism is where their powers are clearly separated. They are clearly two distinct governments. The national government has their powers, and the states have their powers. Cooperative federalism is where they start to get blended. They start to get intermingled. Now, when our country first started, it was dual federalism. All the way from the beginning up until 1933. 32, 33? What happens then? 1932? Great Depression. Up until then, the states were saying, remember, we didn't want this national government. National government, you have your powers, we have ours. Separate powers. Great Depression happens. Everyone's poor, everyone's jobless, everyone's homeless. National government, come help us out. And we're going to start blending. They're going to start cooperating. And that's the way our government has been up until the 1970s or 80s. 1970s or 80s. And then it goes back to what is called, in the Reagan era, it's called new federalism, which is trying to return the power back to the states. And if you easily make the argument that now we are in incredibly cooperative federalism again. But for the test, you need to know, for this test and the AP test, the beginning of our country up until the Great Depression, it is dual federalism. Then it switches over to cooperative federalism up until the 70s or 80s, and that's called new federalism, where they're trying to return the power back to the states, trying to separate the governments again. Which is basically, generally speaking, the Republicans want dual federalism, and the Democrats, generally speaking, want cooperative. Okay, something else you will need to know for this test. And you can look this up on the AP PowerPoint, and there'll be little pictures, right, because you guys know I can't draw. They are both represented by a metaphor. The dual federalism is represented by a layer cake. A layer cake. I'm not going to try to draw, so I'll just embarrass myself. You've seen a cake where there is both chocolate cake and there is white cake. And the chocolate cake is on top, and the white cake is on the bottom. You guys know what I'm talking about? That is called a layered cake. There's a layer of chocolate, and there's a layer of white. And they are distinct. And they are distinct. If you wanted to, you could slice your little cake in half and eat only the chocolate cake, or eat only the white cake. That's a layered cake. There's also a type of cake, and this is what cooperative federalism, and this is on the AP test. I'm not making this up. It's in every AP book. I'm not just hungry for cake. Okay? It'll be on the AP test. The metaphor for the cooperative federalism is a marble cake. Have you ever seen a cake where the chocolate and the white cake is like mixed, swirled? There you go, swirled. Okay. That's the metaphor for cooperative federalism. It's very hard to get just a piece of chocolate cake on there. Okay? If you cut it in half, it doesn't change anything. Layer cake, they are distinct layers. Two distinct layers of government. Marble cake, they're kind of all mixed together. We good? Okay. And I will go over this again when I lecture from the AP chapter. Yes? Cooperative goes from the Great Depression up until the late 1970s, 1980s. It's at the end of like the Reagan era is where it kind of flips back to new federalism, which is kind of going back to dual federalism. Yeah, late 1970s, early 1980s. It'll all be in the AP book as well. Okay, we got to push through here. So, we're going to focus on just cooperative federalism now and how it occurs, or why it occurs. Okay, so the basic idea of federalism is that there's two distinct layers of government, but there's still much cooperation between them. I am going to actually go over this slide very quickly. I'm going to go to the next slide and then come back to this one, because I don't like the way it's organized. But there's things called grants and aids. And your definition for grants and aid is money given from one level of government to another. Now, it's almost always from the national government to the states. So, grants and aids are money and other resources that the states get. And leave revenue sharing aside for now. It'll make a lot more sense or be much more poignant if I go out of order. So, here we go. Here are three types of grants. Three types of grants. The first one is called a block grant. This is money that the national government gives to the states for a broad purpose, for a wide purpose. And they say, here you go, states, here's money to spend on transportation. Use it however you want on transportation. And there are very few strings attached. Go ahead, spend it how you want. The second type is called a categorical grant. Categorical grants are money that they give to the states for a very narrowly defined purpose. Here's $10 million for school lunches. So the block grants you can use for a wide variety of things, and there's no strings attached. A categorical grant is for a specific thing, and there are strings attached. And here's how it goes down. I know you guys love your standards that you use. You know, that's all posted on our walls. Okay? These are pushed by the national government. Now, we've mentioned earlier that states are the ones who control the public school system because it says nothing about schools in the 10th Amendment. It says powers not given to the national government, blah, blah, blah. Here's what happens, though. The states are broken after the Great Depression. Now, let me back up for a test question. There's always been grants and aids, okay, and they are traced back to the power of the government to levy and collect taxes. But it's after the Great Depression that they get really out of control because the states now are broke and they need help. So the national government says, okay, states, here's $10 billion for your school. You want it? We go, yeah. They go, whoa, whoa, hold on. Hold on, not so fast there. You want the money for the school? You got to use these national standards. That is why you have standards. Every single state except for one, I think it was South Dakota or New Hampshire or something, they said, we don't want your money, we're not using the standards. The rest of us were so broke, we said, okay, we'll use your standards. And we'll follow that because we need the money. I mentioned earlier that a state could lower their drinking age, but they all keep it at age 21. Also, states control what the BAC, what the drunk driving, was it blood alcohol content or? It's in every state it's 0.08. Now they could lower it, they could raise it up to 0.2, you'd be dead, but they could raise it up to 0.2. But what happens is the federal government says, you want money for your freeways? Raise your BAC to 0.08. Raise your drinking age to age 21. So states get money with the categorical grants, and what does the national government get? Influence. They get to push their agenda on the states. Third type is a project grant, and these ones are usually used for research. Okay? They're usually used for research. Let's say the government decides we really need to find a cure for cancer. We're going to have a project grant out there. And everyone who's interested in researching cancer problems or cause of cancer, they all put out a proposal, they write a grant for it, and the national government reads and goes, oh, this group sounds like they got a good idea. Here's $1 billion to research cancer. Okay, so project grant, it's applied for research. A categorical grant, it's for a specific purpose, and there are many strings attached. And a block grant is for a broader purpose with no strings attached. Okay, project grants, leave them aside. That's for research. What would the states prefer? Categorical grants or block grants? Block grants. You can use it for a broader thing, and you don't have the strings attached of doing what the national government says. Now let's go back to the previous slide. Hey, grants and aid, we just discussed the three types. Over here, though, revenue sharing. This is what the states really like. This happens between 1972 and 1987. Here, they're not grants. They're not saying you got to use this for schools or like a block grant. Use it for anything in your school. Or a categorical grant. Here's for books, but you got to use standards. Revenue sharing was when the national government had a surplus, had extra money. And they took the extra money and they divided it amongst the states. They shared the revenue. They shared the money. They go, here you go, states. Use it for whatever you want. It could be transportation. It could be schools. It could be welfare, whatever. A few things you need to know for this test and probably for the AP test. Ronald Reagan stops it at the end of his career because the national government no longer is having money. It's going broke. The other thing you need to know. Ronald Reagan, up until then, they were using tons and tons of categorical grants. That's the narrow one with the strings attached. Ronald Reagan gets rid of those and goes to block grants. Because his administration and his Republican Party, they want to return power back to the states. They want to give the states more freedom. You guys with me on that? And that coincides directly with what I mentioned earlier about new federalism. Returning the power back to the states. You good? I'll give you a minute. Question? I don't know who determines it, but right now the way it's working, at least for the federal level, the more money you make, the higher percentage you pay to the government. It's called a progressive tax. And I talked about this when you guys did your ideology, the making of numbers with someone close. If you make less than 10,000, you don't pay any taxes. If you make up from 10,000 to 30,000, you pay 20% taxes. From 30,000 to 70,000, 30% taxes. 100,000 to 500,000, 50%. Over that, 60%. I don't know exactly how the state works. And that, you know, it actually, each state gets to determine that. Because I believe it is Texas who does not have any state tax. They believe, with the Republican type theory, that let the people have more money so they can create more businesses, so they'll hire more people, so their economy will grow. That's the way they grow their economy. All right, let's push through. We got 15 minutes, so I'm going to need all that. All right, we've yapped about all this. Make sure you know this. Guaranteed to be on the AP test. Guaranteed. Right, and when we get to the AP, they break it down a little differently, but it's all the same idea. Okay, how are states going to interact with each other? Okay, no state can enter into any treaty, alliance, or confederation. A state cannot enter into a treaty with another country. They cannot enter into an alliance with another state, nor can they form a confederation. However, a state can make what's called an interstate compact, but it has to be approved by Congress. An interstate compact, remember, inter means between states. And this is agreement amongst the states. And there's about 200 or so. And California actually has an interstate compact with Nevada and Arizona and Utah. And we agreed to share all of our law enforcement data. Okay, so if you break the law here in California and you get fingerprinted, and now you are in Nevada or Utah and you get pulled over, and they type your name in, they will find everything that you did wrong in California. We've agreed to share all of the criminal records. And that is an interstate compact that we agreed to. It has to be approved by Congress. Okay, full faith and credit. There is a full faith and credit clause of the Constitution that says that each state has to recognize the laws, the documents, and the court proceedings of other states. Another way of saying that is they have to recognize each of the laws other states make. They have to look at their documents for the records, things like a birth certificate or a marriage certificate. So if I get married in California and then I move to Texas, Texas has to acknowledge that my marriage exists and it's real. If I have a birth certificate from California that says I was born in 1975 and I moved to New York, they have to accept that birth certificate as valid. You have to accept the documents of other states and the court proceedings of other states. If I am found guilty of stealing a car in California and I go to Texas, they cannot say, don't worry about it. They have to accept that I am guilty in California and they got to send me back. It's called extradition. It'll be on another slide. Now there are two exceptions. One state cannot enforce another state's criminal laws, which I kind of just said. If I am guilty of murder in California and I go to Texas to try to hide and they catch me, they cannot try me in Texas. They have to send me back to California, where California will enforce the law. The other one is in certain divorces. And this is a court case that I can't imagine. You don't need to know for the AP test, but I'll tell you anyway. It is Williams versus North Carolina. Here's what goes down. And my numbers might be off, but I think they're actually correct. In North Carolina, they have a law that says if you get married and you want to get a divorce, you have to wait 6 months. Try to work it out. Talk about it. Okay. Well, Williams and Williams get married, and they hate each other. They can't stand each other. So they want to get a divorce. But they can't get a divorce in North Carolina because they just got married. So they move to Nevada. And they stay there for about a week. Nevada doesn't have the rule that says you got to wait 6 months. They go to Nevada for about a week, and then they get a divorce in Nevada. They immediately move back to North Carolina and say, we're divorced. And North Carolina says, no, you got to wait 6 months. Nope, we went to Nevada. We got a divorce. Full faith and credit. You have to acknowledge the documents of other states. Goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, we know what you did. You weren't really a resident of Nevada. You just tried to work your way around the system. Your divorce is not valid. What the Supreme Court says is, in order to do something like that, you have to be a bona fide resident, which means an actual resident, for real. You can't just go there, stay in a hotel for a couple nights, get a divorce, and move back. Right, now, this part is not on the test. It could come up on an AP test, so you could use it. But here's an interesting dilemma. We have a lot of controversy about gay marriage in the United States. And it's something that should be left up to the states. Because nothing in the Constitution says anything about marriage, so states get to control marriage. Which on the surface is perfectly fine. If California wants to allow gay marriage, good for them. And if Texas wants to say you can't have gay marriage, good for them. Go move whatever state you want to. Herein lies the problem. Let's say that I'm in California, and I get married to my gay partner. I am married in California, gay marriage. And then I move to Texas. And I say, full faith and credit, cowboys. According to full faith and credit, they would have to acknowledge my marriage as a legal marriage. And Texas does not want to acknowledge my marriage as a legal marriage. So there's a conflict in there of states should be allowed to control their own laws, but full faith and credit says you got to obey the laws of others in the documents, and that's where the tension's at. And because if that wasn't there, who cares if California allows gay people to get married? If you don't like it, go live in Texas, right? Or Utah. Right? But full faith and credit makes it apply, and this is why some members of the Republican Party want to make an amendment, 28th Amendment, that defines marriage as between one man and one woman. Now there would be a national amendment that says gays cannot be married, and supremacy clause says that there could be no gay marriage anywhere. Right? So that's what's going on that idea. It's going to be really interesting to see where it goes and where it ends up with the Supreme Court. It's going to be real interesting. Okay, extradition. Extradition is a legal process by which the fugitive from justice in one state is returned to that state. And so if I'm guilty of a crime in California and I go to Ohio to hide out and they catch me, they extradite me back to California. They send me back to California where I will be tried. And governors are the ones who handle the extradition process. So if they find me in Ohio, the governor of California calls the governor of Ohio and says, hey, send Lonnie back. Yeah, we want to prosecute him. If the governor refuses, then the governor of California could go to the national court system and say, hey, force this guy to send it back. And then they send it back. Last slide. Privileges and Immunities Clause. The Privileges and Immunity Clause says, I'll read it to you, no state can draw unreasonable distinctions between its own residents and those persons who happen to live in other states. Translated. You have to treat the visitors from other states the same way you treat the residents of your state. So here in California, we have a sales tax. I go buy a candy bar for $1 and it ends up being $1.08, right? There's an 8% sales tax. You with me? Right? They cannot say, oh, look at you, you're visiting from New York. It's $1.25 for you, 25% sales tax. And they have to treat each of the, whether you're a resident of the state, whether you live there, or whether you're visiting, you have to treat them the same. Court case comes up in California. California, and we get denied. California tries to give less amount of welfare money to people who just moved to the state. Here's what happened. I'm going to make up the numbers. But the idea is correct. California, if you've lived in California your whole life or for a long time, and you make under a certain amount of money, I'm making up numbers here, you get $20,000 in welfare. California tried to say, if you just moved here within the last 6 months and you're poor, you only get $5,000 of welfare. The problem was California had such a good welfare system, or a generous welfare system, that people from other states were rolling into California just to get more money, because we're handing out the money. California tried to stop that and say, no, you have to be a long-term resident to get the goods. Supreme Court says, no, privileges and immunities clause, everyone gets $20,000. Or I made up the numbers, but that's the idea. There is an exception, though, which will be relevant to you guys. You can draw reasonable distinctions between its own residents and others in things such as charging higher rates for colleges. So if you guys go to UCLA, you're going to pay about $15,000 a year. If someone from New York goes to UCLA, they're going to pay about $25,000 a year. So there's one exception where if you're from out of state, they can make you pay more in college tuition. Other than that, for the most part, you have to treat each people the same. And there is our eagle, and we are done.